Hello, friends, and welcome to this podcast. Confusing and ambiguous? Yeah. Um, I like, I've always kind of liked electronic music. The stuff that I hear now is like, EDM and IDM and all kinds of DMs. Music that is, in general, created with technology, stuff like that over there. Things that create sounds from electricity, and maybe don't have acoustic instruments or stringed instruments or any kind of breath instruments or anything like that. Generally keyboardy kind of stuff or programming, sequencers kind of stuff. I like that kind of thing when it's done right, when it's got some imaginative approach to it. Sometimes you do hear electronic music that sounds like somebody just sort of clicked the preset and just played the simplest melody they could over the simplest bass line. And sometimes that can sound kind of like advertising to me, but there is electronic music where people put a lot of care into it. There's a lot of recent stuff that sounds dance kind of oriented or club, like something you'd hear in the club. It's got that, the techno thing, and then there's some stuff sort of like Stereolab and other kinds of bands that are almost hypnotic, kind of transcendental, kind of take you on a trip. And then there's soundtrack type music. There's music that's sort of cinematic and is kind of what they called listening music. I don't know. This maybe back in the '90s they called it that, but before all that, there were people who were experimenting. They're sort of trying to figure out the language of electronic music. It's sort of like if you go back into the early days of film, during the silent movie era, you see people experimenting with the language of film. They're using a camera and they're trying to figure out, how do we tell stories with this moving picture camera? And they were inventing ways of telling stories with that camera. And they didn't have a book to look at that said, if you want to make somebody look intimidated, put the camera above them and shoot. Those instructions didn't really exist yet. And the way to cut from here to have people look like they're having a conversation with each other and there's an eye line, somebody had to invent that or figure out how to make that work. It's the same with music. When certain new musical technologies come into the landscape of production, people have to sort of figure out what to do with them. And what's interesting is to look into the early days of electronic music and to see what people were doing with synthesizers in the early days. A lot of times they were using them to do like a lead or something, where they were turning the filters up and the glide and all that, and you got all these these kind of funny sounds on synthesizers in a pop song. Suddenly there would be a synthesizer solo or something. There were also a lot of people who were sort of avant-garde experimenting with electronic music. It goes all the way back to the really early days of sound recording, and then into later days, like around the 50s and things like that, where you had soundtracks for movies like Forbidden Planet that was entirely created electronically. But then they, Robert Moog invented his Moog synthesizer, and he and other engineers and whatnot, and other people started trying to figure out how to control the voltage in a way so that you could hook up a keyboard and actually play the notes on a keyboard, and your electronic instrument would play that note, which turned it into a musical device rather than just a sound creation or noise making or tonalities kind of thing. So once that happened, there were people, even classical musicians, who experimented with layering multi-track recording. Because back then, a lot of synthesizers, in fact, I believe all of them were monophonic, which means they could only play one note at a time. You couldn't play chords. You couldn't play chords on the keyboard. It would only play one note at a time. So in order to make music that was more complicated than a one note solo on a pop song, you had to layer them in the recording studio. You had to record one track of you know, what the piccolo would play. Rewind, play track 2 would be what the, you know, violins would be playing, or what one of the violins would be playing. And, you know, in between those, you had to adjust the synthesizer to make it sound a little bit more like a violin. Then after you do that, you adjust it to make it sound like a bass, and then you rewind it and you record again, and you play the cello, the bass, the bassoon, or the, you know, whatever, the tuba or whatever you want to play. And then after however many months of work, you have a song that, you know, like an orchestral layered song. People like Wendy Carlos were doing that with the Switched On Bach albums and the Switched On Brandenburgs. Fantastic albums. And when you listen to that, you have to realize how much work went into that. Basically constructing an orchestral piece of music, one instrument at a time. And not only that, she had to go and like create each instrument, like adjust all the knobs until it sounded like a flute or close to a flute, etc. But then there were some people who were doing kind of leaning into away from sort of classical and soundtrack type stuff. They were leaning into sort of pop music, but a kind of different form of pop music. One of these people is Larry Fast, who you know, programmed. You know, you see pictures of him in front of these banks of gear with knobs and lights all over it. He was like one of those early mad scientists in front of the bank of synthesizers kind of guys. He did work later with Peter Gabriel and people like that, did a lot of fantastic work with people. But he did his own albums, and there's several quite good ones. They're interesting to listen to as precursors, sort of, you know, beta version of what we have now as like the IDM or, you know, EDM, those genres where it's not just the you know, the techno beat kind of music, the kind of music that's almost like maybe ambient, but with some elements of musicality, song-like music. Larry Fast was doing that a long time ago. There's an album that he did. This one is called Semiconductor, and it's sort of a compilation of it's a two record set, and it's a compilation of songs from various albums that he did. Electronic Realizations for Rock Orchestra, Sequencer, Chords, Games, Audion, and the Jupiter Menace. There's some great albums that he did. They're very electronic. You know, they're early electronica, and I think they're really fun to listen to. They're not like those. There was a series of records that came out when the Moog synthesizer appeared. A series of records of people doing pop standards, like doing Beatles covers on the Moog, or doing, you know, Tijuana Brass, Moog style, or whatever. And his music is not like that. It's not that sort of attempt to sort of cash in on the Beatles by doing, you know, Eleanor Rigby on the Moog. His stuff is incredible. He does some covers of some classical music, of some soundtrack type music. He does his own compositions. And the sound quality is fantastic. The way it's, you know, the stereo separation and the depth of the music. He really spent a lot of time making sure that all of the tonalities felt cohesive and full. So when you listen to this music, you get this beautiful blooming spectrum of electronic sounds that are really nicely programmed, really interestingly played. Lots of interesting noises and sounds in there too, but it's fun to listen to. I still like this stuff. I'm a sucker for music that is kind of experimental in certain ways, like pushes the idea of what a pop song is, for instance, and takes it into another place, like you know, Senor Coconut doing covers of Kraftwerk songs, for instance. I mean, it's fantastic. But yeah, check out Larry Fast. He's got a bunch of albums worth looking into if you're into electronic music, electronica, and you want to sort of listen to where that came from, where some of those sounds and tones came from, and how it perhaps evolved into what we call electronica here in the present day, in the future where we live now. But anyway, thanks for listening, and I will talk to you again soon.